I'm writing this from my studio apartment in Portland, 2,000 miles away from the wreckage of what used to be my family's perfect life. 3 months ago, we were the Whitman family, successful, admired, the kind of people others aspired to be. Today, our name is synonymous with scandal, deception, and one of the most spectacular public meltdowns in our town's history. What happened to us is a cautionary tale about the deadly cost of caring more about how you look than who you are. My name is Sophie Whitman, I'm 26, and I was raised to be a performance artist. Not the kind who creates actual art, but the kind who turns their entire existence into a carefully choreographed show for an audience that never stops watching. My parents, Victoria and Charles Whitman, didn't just want their family to look perfect. They needed us to be the embodiment of success, elegance, and moral superiority.
Growing up in Greenwich, Connecticut, image wasn't just important, it was everything. My mother, Victoria, was a former Miss Connecticut who had parlayed her beauty queen background into a successful event planning business catering to the ultra-wealthy. My father, Charles, was a prominent investment banker whose client list read like a who's who of Fortune 500 CEOs. Together, they had built not just wealth, but a reputation as the golden couple who had it all. Our house was a 7,000-square-foot colonial that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. And it frequently did. Victoria made sure we were featured in Connecticut homes and gardens at least twice a year. Our Christmas parties were legendary, attended by judges, politicians, and business leaders. Our family vacations to Martha's Vineyard were documented extensively on social media, each photo carefully staged to showcase our happiness and success. But living inside that perfection was suffocating.
From the time I could walk, every aspect of my life was curated for public consumption. My clothes were selected not based on what I liked, but on what would photograph well and reflect the family's sophisticated taste. My extracurricular activities were chosen not for my enjoyment, but for how they would look on college applications and in local newspaper features about accomplished families. I played tennis not because I loved it, but because it was a respectable sport practiced by the right kind of people. I took piano lessons not because I was musical, but because cultured families had children who played classical instruments. I attended charity galas not to help causes I cared about, but because Victoria needed photos of our family giving back to the community. The pressure was relentless and subtle. It wasn't overt abuse, it was the constant, grinding expectation that we would never embarrass the family, never fall short of the image, never give people reason to whisper about the Whitmans. What will people think wasn't just a question in our house. It was the lens through which every decision was made. My younger brother Jake, now 23, dealt with the pressure by becoming the perfect son. Star athlete, honor student, charming personality that made adults gush about what a wonderful young man the Whitmans had raised. But I could see the cracks even then, the way he'd lock himself in his room for hours, the panic attacks he hid during high school, the way he'd flinch whenever Victoria pulled out her camera for another spontaneous family moment. My younger sister Meredith, 21, was the family rebel, but even her rebellion was carefully managed. She was allowed to be artistic and free-spirited because that fit a certain narrative about creative youngest children. Her photography hobby was encouraged because it showed the family's support for the arts. Her vintage clothing style was praised as unique and sophisticated. Even her rebellion was part of the performance. As for me, I was cast as the responsible oldest daughter. Ivy League education, internships at prestigious firms, serious boyfriend from an equally impressive family. I followed the script perfectly, graduating summa cum laude from Yale and landing a job at a top consulting firm in Manhattan. From the outside, I was everything my parents had groomed me to be.
But inside, I was dying. I had no idea who I actually was beneath all the expectations and image management. I liked what I was supposed to like, wanted what I was supposed to want, and felt nothing genuine about any of it. I was a walking, talking representation of my parents' success, but I wasn't a person. The first crack in our family's facade came 2 years ago, when Jake had what Victoria euphemistically called a small breakdown during his senior year at Princeton. The truth was much darker. He'd been struggling with severe anxiety and depression for years. self-medicating with alcohol and prescription drugs, and had finally collapsed during finals week. But even Jake's mental health crisis was managed for appearances. Victoria spun it as academic burnout and pushing himself too hard because of his high standards. She made sure he got treatment at an exclusive private facility in California, far from anyone who might gossip. When he returned, she crafted a narrative about his growth experience and how proud she was of his courage in seeking help. Jake played along because he didn't know how to do anything else. But I could see that something fundamental had broken in him. The performance continued, but there was no life behind his eyes anymore. Meredith's crack came next, though it took longer for us to recognize it. She started missing family events, claiming she was busy with art projects or studying abroad. When she did show up, she was distant, almost hostile. She'd make sarcastic comments during Victoria's photo sessions and roll her eyes at Charles's networking conversations. Victoria interpreted this as typical young adult rebellion that Meredith would grow out of. She's just finding herself, she'd tell people. It's so important for creative types to have their experimental phase. But I knew Meredith wasn't experimenting, she was suffocating. She'd started dating someone our parents hadn't approved for family photos, working jobs that didn't fit the family narrative, making choices that prioritized her happiness over her image. And Victoria was slowly freezing her out in response. My breaking point came last year, when I made the mistake of bringing home a boyfriend who didn't meet the family standards. Marcus was a social worker I'd met through a volunteer program. He was kind, intelligent, passionate about helping people, and completely unimpressed by wealth or status. For the first time in my life, I was in a relationship based on genuine connection rather than strategic compatibility. When I brought Marcus to our annual summer party, the disaster was immediate and brutal. He didn't know the right people, didn't have the right background, didn't fit the image of successful young professional that Victoria had envisioned for my future husband. He wore a suit from Men's Warehouse instead of Brooks Brothers. He talked about his work with homeless veterans instead of investment opportunities. He was perfectly polite and respectful, but he was authentically himself instead of performing wealth and status. Victoria pulled me aside halfway through the evening. "Sophie, honey, he seems very nice, but he's not appropriate for our family. You understand what I mean, don't you?" I understood exactly what she meant. Marcus wasn't rich enough, connected enough, impressive enough to be part of our carefully curated life. Dating him would compromise the family's image of success and exclusivity. That night, for the first time in my life, I fought back. "Mom, I love him. He makes me happy. Isn't that what matters?" Victoria's smile never wavered, but her voice got ice cold. "Happiness is a luxury, Sophie. Image is forever. People remember what they see, not what you feel." The ultimatum was clear: choose Marcus or choose the family. There was no middle ground in Victoria's world. I chose Marcus. And that decision set in motion the chain of events that would destroy everything my parents had spent decades building. The first casualty was my relationship with my parents. Victoria didn't cut me off dramatically. That would have looked bad. Instead, I was gradually edited out of family photos, excluded from social media posts, left off guest lists for important events. I was being slowly erased from the family narrative. Charles was less subtle. He made it clear that my trust fund access would be reevaluated if I continued making poor life choices. When I got engaged to Marcus 6 months later, Charles stopped taking my calls entirely. But the real explosion came during what was supposed to be our family's crowning achievement, Meredith's gallery opening. Meredith had been working for 2 years on a photography series that Victoria assumed would be tasteful portraits or landscapes that would add to the family's cultural reputation. She'd even helped fund the gallery space and invited all of Greenwich's social elite to the opening night. What Victoria didn't know was that Meredith's series was called Performed Lives, and it was a devastating expose of our family's obsession with image over authenticity. The photographs were brutal and brilliant. Candid shots of family events that showed the careful staging behind every spontaneous moment. Images of Jake having panic attacks that Victoria had cropped out of social media posts. Pictures of me looking miserable at charity galas while pretending to be engaged and happy. Shots of Charles practicing his spontaneous toasts and Victoria choreographing our Christmas morning photos. But the centerpiece was a series of self-portraits showing Meredith's own transformation from the artistic daughter she was supposed to be into the person she actually was, someone who had been slowly disappearing under the weight of family expectations. The gallery opening was packed with everyone who mattered in Greenwich society. Victoria had been glowing with pride as she walked through the space, assuming she was about to see beautiful photos that would enhance the family's cultural reputation. Instead, she found herself staring at 20 years of her own image manipulation exposed for everyone to see. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Victoria started hyperventilating in front of 200 of her closest social contacts. Charles began loudly demanding that the gallery remove the photos immediately. Jake, who had been sober for 8 months, disappeared into the bathroom and didn't come out for an hour. But Meredith stood in the center of it all, calm and resolute, finally free from the performance that had been consuming her entire life. "This is who we really are," she told the crowd that had gathered around the chaos. "This is what it costs to look perfect all the time." The story went viral within hours. Someone had live-streamed Victoria's meltdown, and it became a sensation on social media, the perfect family finally cracking under the pressure of their own impossible standards. The local newspaper ran a feature about the dark side of Greenwich perfection. National media picked up the story as an example of wealthy families' dysfunctional relationship with image and social media. Within a week, our family's carefully constructed reputation was in ruins. Charles's business suffered as clients began questioning his judgment and authenticity. Victoria's event planning company lost 3 major accounts when clients decided they didn't want to be associated with the scandal. The house that had been featured in magazines became a curiosity for people driving by to gawk at the family that had imploded so publicly. But the most devastating casualty was Jake. The public humiliation and exposure triggered a complete breakdown that landed him in psychiatric care for 6 weeks. The brother who had been the golden boy, the perfect son, couldn't handle having his struggles and pain exposed to the world that had always seen him as flawless. In the aftermath, our family didn't just crumble, it completely disintegrated. Charles and Victoria separated within a month, each blaming the other for the disaster. Charles claimed Victoria's obsession with appearances had created an impossible environment for their children. Victoria accused Charles of being absent and leaving her to manage the family's image alone. Their divorce proceedings became another public spectacle as they fought over assets and blamed each other for their children's problems. Jake moved to California after his release from treatment, cutting contact with all of us. The last I heard, he was working at a nonprofit and living under a different name, trying to build an identity that had nothing to do with being a Whitman. Meredith became an overnight sensation in the art world, but the cost was enormous. She'd sacrificed her family relationships to tell her truth, and the weight of that decision has been crushing her. Her follow-up exhibition dealt with guilt, isolation, and the price of authenticity. As for me, I moved to Portland with Marcus and started over completely. No trust fund, no family connections, no safety net except the man I'd chosen over my family's expectations. It's been the hardest and most liberating experience of my life. Working as a high school counselor now, I see kids every day who are struggling with the same pressures I grew up with, the need to be perfect, to perform success, to prioritize image over authenticity. I try to help them understand that the cost of that perfection is higher than they can imagine. The irony is that our family's public humiliation taught me more about genuine connection than 26 years of perfect appearances ever did. The people who matter don't care about your Instagram feed or your house in the right neighborhood. They care about whether you're real, whether you're honest, whether you're willing to be vulnerable and imperfect. Marcus and I got married in a small ceremony last month. No magazine photographers, no social media posts, no performance for anyone except the 20 people who genuinely love us. It was the first family event of my adult life that felt authentic instead of staged. But I think about my family constantly. Victoria is living alone in a smaller house, still trying to rebuild her social standing, but never quite recovering from the scandal. Charles has remarried someone 30 years younger and pretends his children don't exist. Jake is somewhere in California, hopefully healing but completely disconnected from his siblings. The saddest part is that we could have been a real family if we'd been willing to be imperfect. If Victoria had been able to love us for who we were instead of what we looked like. If Charles had been present for our actual struggles instead of just our public achievements. If we'd been allowed to fail, to be messy, to be human. Instead, we became a cautionary tale about the price of perfection. 3 months ago, I got a letter from Jake. It was the first time I'd heard from him since he moved to California. He said he was doing better, that he was learning to live without constantly worrying about disappointing people or maintaining an image. But he also said something that broke my heart. Sophie, I don't know who I am when I'm not performing. I spent so many years being the perfect son that I never learned to be a real person. I'm 23 years old, and I'm just now figuring out what I actually like, what I actually want, what makes me genuinely happy instead of just impressively successful. That's the real cost of our family's obsession with appearances. We raised children who didn't know how to be themselves. I'm sharing this story because I see families everywhere making the same mistakes mine did. Parents who care more about their children's achievements than their happiness. Families who perform their relationships on social media instead of living them in private. People who sacrifice their authenticity for the approval of others who don't really know them. If you're living a performed life, please stop before it's too late. If you're raising children to be impressive instead of authentic, please reconsider the cost. If you're more worried about what people think than what's actually true, please remember that the people whose opinions matter most are the ones who love you regardless of your image. Because the applause for a perfect performance eventually stops. But the damage to your real relationships lasts forever. What would you do if you had to choose between your family's approval and your own authenticity? How much of yourself would you sacrifice to maintain an image that isn't really you? And when the performance finally becomes impossible to maintain, who will still be there when the lights go down? These are the questions I'm living with now. And I hope my story helps you answer them before it's too late to choose differently than we did.